Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk, the weekly Parsha. This week, Kedoshim, Leviticus 19:1, brought to you by Rabbi Michael Skobac. Welcome, Rabbi. It is good to have you again in studio. Seems like it's not enough. Even though today I'll get a double dose of you, everybody else will too, it still doesn't seem like it's enough. Oh, man. So how was your week, sir?
Thank God, I've been okay.
I mean, that's good. That's good. Awesome. Very good. Wow. Well, this, I've been really excited to see this Torah portion because I've been kind of reading over it for about the past 3 weeks because the holy days, kind of had me. I don't understand fully the cycle of the Torah Parsha during the holy days. I just know that there's a cycle, and so so I think I started on Kedoshim a few weeks ago. But that's okay though. So it's going to make it very good for today. So
it's actually the chapter is so short. It's
okay.
Just chapters 19 and 20.
Okay.
So it's a very short portion, and but it's action packed.
Which means I may have some questions or comments to go with you. So.
Oh, there's so much here. There's 64 verses in this chapter, where usually a Torah portion of the week is going to have between 90 and 100, sometimes more than 100. So 64 is pretty short, but there are 51 commandments, 51 Torah commandments packed into this little chapter. So it's pretty intense. It's very intense. And I have so much to share that I'm not sure I'll be able to finish it, but let's try.
Okay, very good.
Look, this year is an unusual year because this year is a leap year in the Jewish calendar. And normally, in a regular calendar year, many of the Torah portions are doubled up. So, for example, in most calendar years, you'll have Acharei Mot and Kedoshim read on the same Shabbat. But when you have a leap year, which was this year, which includes an extra month, so they split these double chapters. So this year, Kedoshim is read by itself. And we read Acharei Mot, actually, was read yesterday in the synagogue on Shabbat. But the theme, as you remember, of Acharei Mot, to a great extent, is the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement service. And that's really the holiest day of the year. When you think about it, Yom Kippur was the 40th day in a cycle that really began a month before the Jewish New Year. Jewish New Year was the first day of the month of Tishrei, the first day of the 7th month, and Yom Kippur is the 10th day of the 7th month. So you have a 10-day period in the beginning of the 7th month, which are called the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, the 10 days of repentance. And these are called the high holy days, the days of awe, the awesome days. So you have this incredible, powerful period of 10 days, very intense, between the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Judgment, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Forgiveness and Day of Purification. And it's preceded by 40 days, by 30 days, the entire month of Elul, preceding Tishrei, is a month which is dedicated to preparing for these 10 days. So you think about it, Yom Kippur is the bottom of the ninth. It's really the end. And so it's such an incredibly holy day. And we reach a very, very high spiritual level. We know that on Yom Kippur, the high priest, who is the holiest person in Israel, went on this holiest day of the year into the holiest place in the world, the Holy of Holies in the Holy Temple, and pronounced God's holy name. There was so much happening on Yom Kippur. And the question is, I guess to a certain extent, once we've now finished Yom Kippur, what happens next? And how do we continue living on that kind of a level throughout the year? And that's really where Parshat Kedoshim comes in, where this week's Torah portion comes in. After we've experienced Yom Kippur and we've gone through the whole, thrust of Acharei Mot, which was last week's Parsha, Kedoshim Tiyu, this week's chapter, really is really dealing with this question. So how does a person continue on that level of spiritual greatness and a spiritually refined level throughout the rest of the year. And that's to a great extent the theme of Kedoshim. Um, what happens really when you go through, we'll see maybe a little bit today, when you go through this chapter, it seems to be a very random list of all these different, commandments. I mentioned 51 commandments out of 64 verses. So it's boom, 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 boom. And it's just, it seems like there's no rhyme or reason to it, no order to it. It just seems to be just a very random uh, collection, a random series of different commandments. And to a great extent, many of them deal with our interpersonal relationships with other people, getting along with other people. So, in many ways, what is happening in this week's Parsha of Kedoshim is that we're learning that we have to bring the holiness of Yom Kippur into our everyday lives, our everyday, mundane, routine relationships. And in that way, we elevate our lives to being like high priests. Each one of us can become like the high priest. The high priest was not just for one person on one day of the year. Each person can elevate themselves to become a high priest. That's why the Torah says, right before the Ten Commandments are given, that Israel is supposed to be a kingdom of priests. Each person should really be a priest. Now, the Zohar, the holy mystical book of the Zohar, says that when the sages were studying the Torah and they came to this portion of Kedoshim, they were just overjoyed. They were just sort of bubbling with joy when they came to Parshat Kedoshim. And the question is why? Why specifically this chapter they found so much joy in? And one of the reasons given, we may get to another one later, is that this chapter begins unusually by saying that Moses spoke to the entire congregation of Israel. Usually, what happens when you read through the Torah is God speaks to Moses, and God gives Moses instructions. And normally, what happened in the normal course of the 40 years in the desert was that Moses would then teach what God revealed to him to Joshua, and then to Aaron, and then to Aaron's sons, and then to Joshua, then to the elders. There was a whole routine of the way the Torah was transmitted, but this chapter was unique because it says, speak to the entire assembly of the children of Israel. That's not said every single time a commandment is given. This particular chapter was said, our sages tell us, literally by Moses to everyone. Everyone was gathered, all the children, all the adults, and Moses revealed this to everyone. And the reason that the mystical sages were so overjoyed was because really the message here is that holiness is not just for an elite few. It's not just for these special individuals who are different and unusual and live this extraordinary life. The message here is that this is for all of Israel, everyone. And that's an amazing thing, that everyone has the ability to reach a level, a life of holiness. As a matter of fact, the passage begins, the chapter begins by God saying, "You shall be holy," and it sounds like a commandment that we're instructed to be holy. But another way of reading it is that God is actually telling us this is going to be a promise that ultimately all of us will be holy. All of us will be able to reach this level and achieve this level of holiness. That's an incredible promise. And because of that promise and that reality that every person has the capability and will succeed in becoming holy, that's why the mystics were overjoyed by this chapter in particular. It's not just something that's within the grasp of a few limited individuals. Now, there's an amazing midrash. The midrash, rabbinical commentary to this chapter, has a very strange comment. It says, after God's instruction that we should be holy because He is holy, the midrash says, perhaps you may think you can be as holy as I am. That's what the midrash suggests. Maybe you're going to think, since God has commanded you to be holy, you can be as holy as God is. And therefore the Midrash says, no, I say to you that my holiness is superior to your holiness. Now, the commentaries are puzzled by this. Why would anyone, how could anyone imagine that they can be as holy as God? As a matter of fact, when God at the end says that my holiness is greater than your holiness, you actually see this in the Hebrew text itself. It's one of the uh, downsides of studying the Bible in English is that you don't get the fullness and the richness of the Hebrew. The English just says, you shall be holy because, or for I, God, am holy. But the two different words holy in this verse are spelled differently in Hebrew. When it says that you shall be holy, when God directs us to be holy, so the word there, Kedoshim, is spelt in a way where the O sound is what we call lacking, meaning that normally the O sound in Hebrew is made with a consonant, which is the Vav. It's a straight line, uh, a straight vertical line. And on top of that straight vertical line would be a dot, which makes the O sound. So that's how the O sound is normally made. But sometimes you'll find in Hebrew the O sound is made without that vertical line, without that consonant called the Vav. All you find is that little dot up in the air. And so that's called uh, a time when the O sound is lacking. It's missing the consonant, the Vav. So when it describes how we're to be holy, it says Kedoshim Tiyu. It's spelled without that Vav, missing that vertical line, which it does say when it describes God's holiness. When it describes God's holiness, it says Ki Kadosh Ani, and there the word Kadosh is written with the vertical Vav and the dot on top of it to show that God's holiness is much fuller, much greater than ours could ever be. But the Midrash says that people might think we can be as holy as God. So the question is, what would that be? Why would people suspect that they could be as holy as God? So one of the approaches is that in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 16, which we read recently, God says, I am God who dwells among them even amidst their uncleanliness. God tells us that he has so much love for Israel that he dwells among us even in our sinfulness, even when we are unclean. So it could be that what the Torah is saying there is that because of God's great holiness, he is able to dwell among us and he is immune to corruption, meaning that his holiness is unaffected even though he's living among and his presence dwells among Israel. So the Midrash is suggesting that perhaps people might think that if God is close to us, even during our sinfulness, our times of sinfulness, and God is able to withstand that corruption and not be affected by it, perhaps we as well could expose ourselves and be among people that are wicked and evil and not be corrupted by them. So the Midrash says, no, your holiness is not as my holiness is. Don't think that you're able to pull that off. Human beings will be corrupted by others. That's why when you go to the book of Psalms, the very first Psalm says that happy or fortunate or blessed is the person who doesn't walk in the way of the wicked and doesn't stand in the counsel of the evildoers, because we will be corrupted by people that we associate with if they are corrupt. And that's one of the lessons the Midrash tries to bring out here. Now, when it comes to defining, what does it mean when it says that you shall be holy? I mean, it could be a very uh, mysterious word. I have a friend of mine that refuses to use the word spiritual because it doesn't mean anything. It says it's so fuzzy and it's so definable in so many different ways. So what does the word holy mean? So there are two very, very famous comments by our early commentaries. One is by Rashi, who lived around the uh, year 1000 approximately. He lived for a while, but let's say he was living around 1,000 years ago. He explains holiness as distancing ourselves from forbidden relationships, from forbidden sexual relationships. So we know that the end of the chapter of Acharei Mot dealt with all of the, or almost all of the forbidden sexual relationships. And Rashi says that when you find holiness, you find people that are so concerned about not committing sexual immoral acts that they take steps in their lives to distance themselves from even getting close to that kind of a life. So, for example, a person that was holy, just as an example, might avoid going to certain parties or watching certain movies or being among people who tell certain kinds of jokes or having certain friends or going to certain kinds of bars, meaning that there's a certain exposure to a world that makes it much more likely that we might get dragged down into a life of sexual immorality and promiscuity. So Rashi explains that when the Torah says here, you shall be holy, he's saying that it refers to people who set up barriers and fences against committing sexual indiscretions. Nachmanides says no. Nachmanides, I mean, he probably would agree that's a good thing to do, but Nachmanides reads it differently. He says that the instruction to be holy is really an instruction to go beyond the letter of the law. And it's interesting that Nachmanides does this in three different areas. There are the areas in the Torah of, we call Ben Adam L'Makom, the relationship between human beings and God, the human divine relationship. Then there's the interpersonal realm, Ben Adam L'Chavero, how human beings get along with other human beings. And then there's Ben Adam L'Atzmo, between ourselves, between us and ourselves, meaning our own inner lives. So he says, for example, in the realm of Ben Adam L'Makom, the ritual realm, the realm of God-human relationships, Nachmanides says that there are all these laws of the Sabbath and how to refrain from prohibited activities on holidays and on the Sabbath. And yet Nachmanides says that the Torah goes beyond all those lists of what we can't do and says that we're supposed to have a Shabbaton, a day of rest. Because he says that it's possible a person might technically avoid doing all of the prohibited things on the Sabbath, and yet they would have a day which is not a Sabbath-like day. For example, a person might spend the whole day reading trade journals on the Sabbath. You're allowed to read on the Sabbath. You're not violating any of the 39 basic prohibitions by reading, but Nachmanides would say that for a person to spend the whole Sabbath reading trade journals, it's not really within the spirit of Shabbat. A person could spend the whole Sabbath basically vegging out, sleeping the whole day, and they're not really going to synagogue, they're not learning Torah, they're not praying, they're not having Shabbat meals and singing Shabbat songs. So that's also basically someone who hasn't violated anything, but they really haven't experienced Shabbat. When it comes to the interpersonal realm, Nachmanides says, the Ramban, who lived after Rashi in the 13th century. So he says that the Torah gives you many, many laws. We'll see some of them today of the interpersonal realm, but it's possible that a person still might technically be within the guidelines of all the legal requirements and not violating any technical legal prohibitions, and yet not really be a righteous moral person. I mean that there are many things the Torah cannot list. The Torah is not able to list every single possible human interaction. Nachmanides says the Torah gives us many, many rules, but then the Torah gives us principles. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 18, the Torah says, V'asita hatov v'hayashar. You shall do that which is good and that which is straight. So Nachmanides there is telling us that what you learn from that kind of general principle is that beyond all the particular specifics of how the Torah describes the realm of human interaction, there's still these general principles which say that you have to live a just and moral life. and sometimes it can't always be spelled out. For example, the Talmud discusses this. If you have a field and you have a number of neighbors that are adjacent to your field, and you want to sell your field, there's nothing in the Torah really which would require that you give your neighbors the offer of first refusal, the right of first refusal, meaning that you want to sell your field, you can put it up on, an advertisement on the internet, or tell anyone you want. But Nachmanides says that no, the Torah says you're supposed to deal with people properly. So if you have a neighbor and you're selling property that's adjacent and abutting their land, you should give them the first right, whether they want to buy it or not. There's nothing specifically in the Torah that requires that, but it would just be the right thing to do. And so Nachmanides says those are two examples in the realm of human-God relationships and human interpersonal relationships. But Nachmanides says when it comes to our own lives, our between us and ourselves, he says that it's perfectly possible for a person to, let's say, only eat kosher food and yet be a glutton, right? The Torah does give you all kinds of laws in terms of what food is prohibited, what food is permitted, but it doesn't tell you, how much to eat. So Nachmanides says that this principle of you shall be holy is basically a principle exhorting us to live a holy life and not be what he calls a navol birshut Torah, a a miserable person, an awful person within the bounds of the Torah, meaning that you're a scoundrel. You're a scoundrel, even though you're technically keeping all the laws of the Torah. Nachmanides says, no, it's not possible. This principle of Kedoshim Tiyu, you shall be holy, is a general principle saying that you have to exercise moderation and not just live a life of total indulgence, even though everything you're indulging in is perfectly permissible according to the letter of the law. I had more I wanted to say here, but I have to be a responsible editor and, and not say everything. Let's go into another approach to this.
Okay.
Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. Ki kadosh ani, for I, God, am holy. So some of the Hasidic masters understand this in a slightly different way. They say that just as God fills all the worlds, God is present in all the worlds, and yet God is separate from the world, right? We see that in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3, where it says in that verse, Kadosh, 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 Hashem Tzvakot. Holy, holy, holy is the God of hosts, and yet Milo kol haaretz kvodo. The whole earth is full of his glory. So they say that just as God fills all the earths and all the universes, and God fills all of existence, yet God remains separate from all of existence, so too the Hasidic masters say that we as human beings should both engage the world. We shouldn't separate from the world and say, I don't want to get married, I don't want to have a job, I don't want to eat too much, I want to spend my whole life fasting, I'm going to take a vow of poverty and a vow of chastity, and I'm going to basically live on a mountain drinking yak's milk and meditating my whole life. I'm going to basically, be separate from the world. So Nachmanides said, the Hasidic masters say that the verse here, Kedoshim Tiyu, shall be holy, for I, God, am holy, is saying to us, just as God is both part of the world and yet separate from the world, so we too are supposed to be engaged with the world. We shouldn't be saying that we want to have nothing to do with the physical world, and yet we should be separate from the world in the sense that we should be worldly people, but not people that are of the world. Meaning that our primary stance in life should be as spiritual people, not as physical people, not as people that are basically primarily focused in life on the material and on the physical. We should see ourselves as basically spiritual people that engage in the physical world. So we're supposed to eat, but you eat in a holy way. You eat by thanking God for the food, by asking God for permission to eat the food, by saying blessings before and after, by sitting at the meal and speaking about holy things at a meal, by inviting guests to your home, meaning there is a way of taking the act of eating and elevating it to be a holy activity. And in the same way that it's a directive to be engaged with the world, so in the same way, even though God is holy and he's separate from the world, but God is involved in our lives. So in the same way that God is both involved with our lives and yet still separate from us, right? Isaiah says in chapter 55, my thoughts are not like your thoughts. We have no way of really totally relating to God. We can't imagine that we relate to God as the same way we relate to our brother or sister. God is separate from us. God is holy, and yet God is very much part of our lives. So the Hasidic masters say, in the same way, we're supposed to be involved with other people in this world. We're not supposed to be hermits. We're not supposed to be people who live lives in isolation. We're supposed to both be of this world, meaning involved with the world, involved with other people, involved in the lives of other people, and yet be separate from the world, meaning not to be caught up with the world and not to be pulled down with everything that happens in the world. That's why, by the way, when Abraham was pleading with God for the people living in the cities of Sodom and Amorah, he says, what if, God, there are 50 righteous people living within those cities, about 45, 30, 20, 10, down to 10, but it's not just 10 righteous people that are living in isolation as hermits in some monastery somewhere, on a cloistered monastery. He says in Hebrew, betoch ha'ir, they're living amongst the city, amongst everyone else, meaning that we have a calling to live amongst the rest of the world, to be, as Isaiah says, a light to the nations. We can't be a light to the nations if we're hiding somewhere. And so we're both to be part of the world, engaged with the world, and yet, in some ways, separate from the world as well. On the same theme of Kedoshim Tihiyu, when we go through this chapter, I mentioned before, it seems like a very long list of random commandments. And, one wonders, is there any rhyme or reason to them? So I want to share one approach that I saw from Rabbi Yehoshua Berman, which is a very interesting one. He says when you go to this initial definition of holiness that we saw that was debated between Rashi and Ramban, Rashi again saying to keep ourselves separate from sexual immorality, and Nachmanides saying to live a life of self-discipline and self-control. In both cases, really, the definitions require people to live lives of being in control of themselves, right? Whether it is setting up fences and protective practices against sexual immorality, or it's exercising self-control in not overindulging in permissible things. Either way, we're talking about people living lives of self-discipline and self-control. Basically, people that are learning how to control their human nature. And so when you go through this chapter, what you see is something very interesting. The chapter begins after this general commandment to be holy. It says, Ish imo ve'aviv tira'u. Every person should fear, be in awe of their mother and father. Appropriate verse for Mother's Day today. So
Yeah, no kidding, right?
So it's interesting that, when you go back to the Ten Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, you see that it's not expressed this way. There it says not to be in fear of or to be in awe of. It says their honor. Honor, there it says your father and mother. Kabed es avicha vesimecha. Honor your father and your mother. But here in Leviticus 19, it says you should be in awe of, you should fear your mother and your father. So you have two things that are interesting. Number one, in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, it speaks about honor, but here in Leviticus, it speaks about fear. And the other thing to notice is that in Exodus, it speaks first about the father and then the mother, but here in Leviticus, it speaks first about the mother and then the father. Why is that? So the Talmud suggests that the reason is actually very obvious. That who are we more likely to fear, right? Are we likely more to be in fear of our mother or our father? So I guess at least when the Talmud was written, maybe for most of human history, it was mostly normal for people to be in fear of their father. The father was the one that was the disciplinarian, usually. The father was, the tougher one, usually, at least. That was the more normative. And the mother was, the one you ran to when you were getting, getting disciplined by your father.
Right.
So that's why when it comes to fear, right, you're more likely to fear your father and less likely to fear your mother. So here in Leviticus, it says, fear your mother and then your father, because you're not likely to fear your mother. So the Torah wants to emphasize, right, that even though you're not likely to fear your mother, you should have awe of your mother as well. But in Exodus, when it speaks about honor, people are much more likely to honor their mothers. Their mothers nurtured them, and mothers are usually less of the disciplinarian. The mother is usually has more mercy towards them. So when it comes to honoring a parent, we're more likely to have that natural closeness to a mother and almost a loving respect and honor of a mother. So there the Torah puts the emphasis on the father. Kabedes avicha vesimecha. Honor your father, then it says your mother. So what you see here is that we have a natural tendency to do one thing, and the Torah tries to really adjust for that tendency and tries to move us in the other direction. So you see here in this first commandment, right, where it says, be in fear of your mother and your father, the fact that we're being directed to fear our mother is really a directive that's not normal. It's not the kind of thing we normally do. And yet the Torah is saying, no, you have to control what your instincts would be. You have to control what your normal inclination would be. And so this proceeds along, again, this theme of the chapter of you have to be in control of yourself. You have to exercise self-discipline. The next commandment is to observe the Shabbat. Now, that's very obvious. People's natural tendency would be to want to continue working on Shabbat. Why should I lose a day of work? I'd rather make money. I'd rather, not fall behind. Mm-hmm. And so the Shabbat demands a certain amount of self-restraint and self-discipline. People aren't normally interested, naturally speaking, to submit themselves to the discipline of 39 prohibitions of the Sabbath. It requires a tremendous amount of discipline. And so a person would rather spend their day doing whatever in the world they feel like doing. And that the Torah says, no, you're not allowed to write. You're not allowed to use electricity. You're not allowed to go on your cell phone. You're not allowed to watch television. You're not allowed to go in a car. You're not allowed to, there's so many things the Torah says you can't do it.
Right.
And so people might sort of resist that. And the Shabbat's saying, no, you've got to exercise self-control, self-restraint. The next prohibition is idolatry. And this is very interesting.
Rabbi, before you go there completely, can I tell you what I heard on? I've got the series by Chabad.org, the Kol Malachim Chumash audio edition, and as he was reading the Kedoshim Parsha this week, he said that in this one of the what they pulled out was you shall honor you shall fear your mother and your father. And it said, even if they tell you to not observe the Sabbath day, you shall keep the Sabbath. I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing that's all inclusive, but I was wondering if there's anything specifically in a certain midrash, because the whole point of this, if for the people out there who are not familiar with the Kol Malachim Chumash, it's like the reading of the Torah along with reading of the midrash and the oral Torah along with it. So that you can kind of just get a nice little buffet. It's kind of neat, but I just didn't understand because as I'm reading it, I don't see it doesn't look like that to me. But I trust them. I mean, I guess they know what they're talking about. But
well, it's one of the things that it's sort of picking up on, right? Is the question of why do you have these two commandments side by side? Mm-hmm. Meaning, what is the connection between honoring your parents and then right away then saying observe the Sabbath? So you might think that, honoring your parents means doing whatever they tell you to do. And so the Torah immediately says, well, but don't forget, the Sabbath is there as, also one of the Ten Commandments. And so honoring your parents would not include, violating the
Oh,
Sabbath
right.
because they tell you to.
Nice. I got it. Good.
So the third one, so we're looking now at this theme of self-control and self-discipline. And so we've seen it both in honoring your parents and fearing your parents and in observing the Sabbath. But then the next commandment is the prohibition against idolatry. And here it's very interesting that our nature, you ever go to a lecture, for example, right? You go to, let's say, a big lecture and it's in a big lecture hall, or you go to a baseball game, even worse, and you're sitting behind, one of these huge poles that hold up the top of the stadium. You know, by nature, we are very visually attuned. We, as human beings, we need to see what's going on. And so if we're at a lecture and you can't see the speaker, it's just very frustrating. And one of the things that I think is so difficult for human beings is relating to a God they cannot see, relating to a God that's invisible, relating to a God that's beyond them. It's just for many people, it's frustrating, it's challenging because we want so much to be able to feel that we can grasp God, and we want to feel that we're able to uh, really have a handle on God. We want to be able to feel close to God, and not to be able to see is very limiting. And so, one of the huge, um, really, it's a huge attraction that idolatry has had for all of history, is that it offers human beings a handle on God, which makes God more accessible. I remember there was a song years ago by Joan Osborne, "What if God was one of us?" Right? Just like that slob on the bus. But it's a
I
very
remember that.
compelling idea
Yeah.
that idolatry was a way of concretizing God so that you could hold God in your hand, or you could have an image of God that you could look at and you could feel, oh, I'm connected to God now. And so, one of the most compelling ideas behind Christianity was this idea that in order for human beings to be able to connect with God, God came down into the human realm, took on human flesh, so that now human beings can have some access to God. That by having Jesus walk among human beings, as it says in the New Testament, to tabernacle among us, that was very compelling. That people, I think, found this idea of a God who took on human form, so that now, when we think of God, we can have in our mind, right, an image of this person. That's why, so many physical things in Christianity have been popular, either a cross or in the Eastern and Catholic rites to have actual statues of Jesus. Um, it's a way of giving people access and a handle to the divine. And that's a huge, huge temptation, a huge draw. And so the Torah says to us, no. The Torah says you have to resist that human temptation. You've got to overcome that temptation to want to have a physical representation of God, and you cannot have it. And what's interesting is that in the Torah, the path for bonding with God is exactly the opposite of these idolatrous paths, meaning that God never says to us in the Torah or anywhere in the Tanakh that you will be able to relate to me because I am going to become more human. It's the exact opposite. God says the opposite. God says that you're going to be able to relate to me and get close to me because you can become holy as I, God, am holy. Meaning that by telling us in the beginning of this chapter, you should be holy, what God is saying is that human beings can become more godly, not that God's going to become more human.
Interesting.
And so the message of Kedoshim Tiyu is so powerful because God is saying that I want you to do this. And the fact that God is saying, I want you to do it, is an indication that we can do it. And that's why the language says, and you will be holy, meaning this is something that's going to happen, that human beings can actualize this potential because ultimately we were created in the image of God. We have something godly about us to begin with. And that's why Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin would always say, we don't only have to believe in God, we have to believe in ourselves as well, because God believes in us. God has that much faith in us that God says, I know that you can do it. I know that you can become godly. I know you have the ability to become holy. And that's why the Torah's basic message is to be holy. And the Torah tells us how to accomplish that. Now, the fourth one in this series is called the prohibition against pigul. So we know that if a person brings a shlamim, a sacrifice that was called a peace offering, in the sense that it brought peace to everyone because this was the only sacrifice that was eaten by three parties, so to speak. God received part of it on the altar. The person that owned the animal was able to eat some of it, and the priests ate of it as well. So everybody got a portion from the peace offering. They're called the shlamim. And there was a time limit. You had to eat it within 2 days and 1 night. So the law here is that if while you're sacrificing it, you have in your mind that I'm going to eat it after this time period, so that thought, just that thought, disqualifies the animal. And the penalty is very, very strict here. I believe it says you'll be cut off from your people for this prohibition. So here again, what the Torah is requiring is that we control our thoughts even. We all often think that we're not capable of controlling our thoughts. And yet here there's a prohibition which would disqualify the sacrifice if we have inappropriate thoughts at the moment we're sacrificing it. So what happens afterwards is you have a long list of all these laws in this chapter, many of them dealing with the interpersonal realm. And I believe the message here is that unless we are able to control ourselves and exercise self-control and self-discipline and not always do those things that are instinctual and those things that our bodies drive us to want and desire, we have to be able to exercise control over ourselves. Only then we'll be able to live lives in conjunction with other people, because otherwise we're going to always give in to our self-interest. I want to share one more thought about Kedoshim to you, and then maybe we'll have a few minutes to go a little bit beyond this verse.
Okay. That's okay. This is covering the good stuff.
So I mentioned again, you have this famous dispute between Rashi and Ramban. What does it mean to be holy? Does it mean to abstain from activities that are going to bring you close to prohibited activities, or does it mean to abstain from permissible activities, right? But that you could easily overindulge in. So both of these approaches are basically speaking about avoidance, what you're not allowed to do. You shouldn't get close to sexual impropriety. You shouldn't overindulge. You shouldn't live a life without restraints. But there's a famous book of ethical teaching called the Mesilat Yesharim, The Pathways of the Just, by Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. It was written around the year 1730, I think, approximately then. And it's one of the greatest books ever written in the Jewish library. It's a incredible guide, basically, to how to become a perfect person. And it goes through a series of steps. It takes you step by step by step. And chapter 26, which is the last chapter of the book, teaches you about the level called Kedusha, of holiness. So he describes holiness differently. He doesn't speak about holiness in a negative way in terms of what you should avoid. He speaks about holiness in a positive way. For Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, holiness is basically attaching ourselves to God, both in our deeds and in our thoughts, meaning that he sees it as living a life where whatever we're doing and whatever we're thinking, we should be connected to God. What the Bible calls this is devekut. Devekut is the word for bonding or attachment. It's actually the word in Genesis when God says, therefore every man should leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. It's the word for intimacy. And it's a very powerful word. I mean, in Genesis, it's used obviously for sexual intimacy between a man and a woman, but in the book of Deuteronomy, it's used for the kind of spiritual intimacy we're supposed to have with God. In modern Hebrew, the word devek is the word for glue. So the Torah is saying we're supposed to have this kind of attachment to God. And so the Ramchal in the Path of the Just says that to live a life of holiness means that whatever we're doing, we should be attached to God. We should be connected to God. And he says that it's basically virtually impossible for us to actually achieve this level. He says that all the other levels in the book you can achieve. He says when it comes to holiness, you can only undertake the beginnings of this level. You can only strive and work towards it. And he says, but then after you work towards it, if you're successful, it will be given to you as a gift. Ultimately, he says you can't do it all by yourself, but you can start the process. Now, what's interesting is that he sees holiness, kedusha, as basically attachment to God. So the question is very obvious. So why does the rest of the chapter spend so much time focusing on interpersonal human relationships? So I saw an interesting discussion by one of the rabbis here in Toronto, Rabbi Eliezer Breitowitz, who takes us to the Chabad book of philosophy called the Sefer Tanya. And in the 31st and 32nd chapters of Tanya, it basically explains that the human soul is not totally comfortable in a physical body. The soul is very spiritual, the body is very physical, and the body to a great extent obstructs the soul from its spiritual pursuits and spiritual goals. It's not the natural environment for a soul. And yet there's a very important reason why God put us in a body for our lifetime down here on earth. But just in the same way that our body interferes with the pursuits of the soul, he says so too in many ways having to live in a world with other people also gets in the way, because when it comes to living with other people, we're competitors with them. We have in some way a competitive relationship with people in the world when it comes to the world of the physical, when the world of the material. So when it comes to monetary issues, when it comes to property, when it comes to, all the things in this world, it's hard to deal with other people because we are in competition with them. Because if you have it, I don't have it. And it makes life difficult for us spiritually. But the Sefer Tanya says that we are only competitors with people. We only compete with them when it's in the physical realm. But when it comes to the spiritual realm, he says it's the opposite. We don't compete with other people because spiritually we're all connected. Our souls are really all connected. Our souls are really all one. And so when it comes to spiritual gain, whatever I gain spiritually benefits other people. So he says that's why this chapter of Kedoshim Tiyu spends so much time discussing interpersonal relationships, because what it's saying basically is that in order to have a successful life in the interpersonal realm, we have to be people that are directed more towards living a spiritual life than a life of the material. The more we're focused on the material and the physical, the harder it's going to be to live a life of peace and just getting along with other people in a ideal way. He says the more we focus ourselves spiritually, though, we're less in competition with others, we're more naturally bonded to others, and we're able to get along with others on a much easier level. I heard an amazing story I often tell over from Rabbi Yitzchak Buxbaum, who was a storyteller, Jewish storyteller. He says when you look at the creation story, so when Adam and Eve are created, when Adam is created, God takes earth from the ground, takes dirt and earth, and he forms the earth into the shape of a human being. And then we're told that God breathes the breath of life into that shape, into that physical body that God built from the earth and the dirt. And Buxbaum says when you look at this story of the creation of man, where God takes earth, forms it into a human shape, and the Bible says, the Torah says that is called B'Tselem Elokim. That human being is in the image of God. He says that's exactly what happens when human beings build an idol. When humans make an idol, we take earth, we take dirt, we take clay, we shape it into an idol. And in Hebrew, an idol is called a tselem, the same word. The same word that the Bible uses for the image of the human being is the same word used for an idol, because they both look like the same construction. You take earth, dirt, clay, you make a form. And he says that the message of the Torah is that if you want to serve God, God is saying to us, you want to serve me? Don't serve what you make in my image. That's idolatry. God is saying to us, serve what I made in my image. And what God made in his image are other human beings. So the Torah is basically telling us, you want to get close to God, you want to serve God, serve other human beings. Put yourself at their service, help them. Live a life where you're in service of other people, rather than serving what we make in the image of God. So that's really what I wanted to share on the just the verse of Kedoshim TU. And you know what? I think we'll have to do the rest of what I prepared next time around. 'Cause I don't want to go past 1 hour with you.
Gotcha.
There really is. I probably can squeeze in another hour just on this first verse.
I don't doubt it. I'll tell you what, I've listened to probably, oh my gosh, at least 8 or 9 different podcasts from Chabad.org with different rabbis, and every one of them is like completely different. I don't even know how they could be put into one little bundle. I don't know. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week at same time, same place. I say we. Rabbi Skobac will be in cycle again in about 6 or 8 weeks, maybe sooner if I get lucky. So meanwhile, come back here in 4.5 hours at 8:30 p.m. Central. You'll be able to see this smiling Rabbi once again for Acts chapter 9. Notice I left out the verse, but I think I finally got the verse figured. I mean, the actual episode is like 41. Anyway, it's lovely. It's juicy, juicy, juicy. Everybody, thank you so much again for tuning in, and we will see you later on tonight. Shalom, shalom. Shalom, Rabbi.